Every week, Question Time travels to a different part of the United Kingdom. Tonight, we have come to South London, to Dulwich. Just 4 or 5 miles from the centre of political power at Westminster, this area has been dominated for some time by Labour at local and national level. But our audience members arriving here this evening, as with every other week, reflect the wide range of political views and voting record across the nation. And they want to discuss the new proposed changes to the justice system, including shorter prison sentences. And you might have noticed there was a new deal with the EU this week. They want to talk about that too. Welcome to Question Time from Dulwich in South London. The government is Nick Thomas-Symonds. As Minister for European Union Relations, he led the talks into the small hours to seal this week's deal with the EU. More generally, he's a Cabinet Office Minister. Kieran Mullen is the Conservatives' Shadow Justice Minister. Before entering Parliament in 2019, he was a volunteer police officer, a special constable and a doctor in A&E, during which time he managed to campaign to leave the EU as well. For over a decade now, Zanny Minton-Beddoes has been Editor-in-Chief of the global news and analysis magazine The Economist. Prior to that, she was the paper's business editor and was an economist at the International Monetary Fund. The journalist Inaya Folarin Iman is a former Brexit Party candidate and founder of the free speech forum The Equiano Project. She's also a columnist, commentator and regular panellist on BBC Radio 4's Moral Maze. And Hashim Mohammed attended what he calls some of the country's worst schools. But since then, he's gone to Oxford, become a successful barrister, presents radio documentaries and has written 2 books on social mobility and housing. Welcome to our panellists, welcome to our audience here in Dulwich, great to see you, and welcome to you at home. Thank you very much for watching. You can just sit back and enjoy the programme, or you can take part in the conversation on social media, which is always pretty lively. Anyway, let's kick off with our first question, which is from Finola Gowers.
Has the government's EU reset deal given away more than we have gained?
So that was Monday, we found out about that. You were absolutely in the nerve centre of sorting this deal out. Have we given away more than we have gained?
Absolutely not. This deal is a real win for Britain. I set out with objectives of delivering a deal that would be good for jobs, that would lower bills, and that would be good for securing our borders. What we secured in those negotiations for the country, and by the way, don't take my word for this when I say about the price of the weekly shop falling. Just listen to what leading supermarkets are saying about how it will change cost pressures. Listen to Morrison's, listen to M&S, listen to Lidl. When I say that what we've done on energy will bring energy bills down, don't listen to me, listen to what Octopus Energy have been saying about bringing bills down. And on borders, you know, issues like serious and organised crime, where international criminals do not understand, recognise or respect borders. We will have more tools now, like facial recognition, sharing of information, enabling us to keep people in this country safer. We have a security and defence partnership too with the European Union, complementing our membership of NATO. So I've no doubt at all that this deal is going to make Britain safer, more secure and indeed more prosperous. It is in our national interest and other parties should be supporting it.
Well, Kieran, far from supporting it, the Conservatives, I mean, Kemi Badenoch has said she's going to reverse the whole thing.
Well, let's be clear about what's happened this week. This is a Labour Party that is desperate in government for a positive news headline, and that's not surprising when you think about the challenges they're facing on economic growth, on unemployment, on things like the winter fuel payments, which they cut for 10 million pensioners. They're incredibly unpopular, and they're just desperate for anything that makes it look like they're delivering, because they haven't been across the board.
So do you think this is a positive news line, then?
It's not when you see the fine print, I'm afraid, Fiona. It's easy to conclude a negotiation if you give the other side what they want. That isn't a success for this country, and particularly, for example, for our fishermen. One of the main beneficiaries potentially from Brexit is the fishermen, and that we could switch back to every year negotiating really hard for them for a deal that's going to work for them. And of course the EU are desperate to stop us doing that, and instead Labour have handed them a 12-year agreement that is not in the interests of British fishermen, and the industry has been very clear clear about saying that.
Can we just talk about the fishing deal for a minute? Just because, obviously, what this is a continuation of the deal that the Conservative government brought in, admittedly for much longer. But the government described it at the time as the best possible deal, not only for our fish-catching sector, but the industry as a whole. Was that not true,
Fiona, but the point...
Because I assume on that basis you'd be thrilled to see it gone for another 12 years.
As you said yourself, admittedly, for a much longer period.
Yeah, but the best possible deal...
the fishing industry were
clear... Was it
not
the best possible deal?
The fishing industry were clear that we had to maintain a year-by-year negotiating position. Because, of course, if you sign up
but just to be clear, Kieran, the government described it as the best possible deal. Now it sounds like the worst possible deal. Which is it?
At that point in time, as a transition immediately out of the long deal that we've been in as part of the EU, that was the best deal that we could secure at that time. With the prospect, as the fishing industry have made very clear, that in the long term, we move back to more and more of the fishing stocks coming back to British fishermen. A trade deal, it's not supermarket sweep. You don't get prizes by rushing around,
prices in the
grabbing everything that you can get and saying that's a success. That isn't how negotiations work. You have to be tough sometimes. You have to be willing to say no. And I'm afraid not just on fishing, but on allowing the EU, again, the EU courts to have a say in what we do and how we run our country. On other issues, the mobility scheme, again, bringing free movement back in through the back door. They have surrendered on so many issues. I'm not surprised the EU are quick and wanting to sign that deal.
Zanny, you're sort of laughing halfway through.
I'm not laughing, but I'm kind of chuckling. I think you're both exaggerating. I think it's not a great surrender, but nor is it, I think, as the Prime Minister said, the historic start of a new era. This is a relatively sensible... It's a sensible deal that modestly reduces some of the worst frictions of Brexit. It doesn't change anything very dramatically. I think the idea of getting rid of the checks on food is very sensible. You're absolutely right. It's sensible for our supermarkets. It's a very sensible idea. I think it's a sensible idea to join the energy market. Data sharing against criminals is a very sensible idea. But none of this is going to be enormously transformative for the British economy. We are going to now be able to take part in European defence spending at a time of increased geopolitical threats. That strikes me as being very sensible. But this is a small and sensible step forward. But basically, the red lines of Brexit, of a hard Brexit, are still there. We're not joining the single market. We're not having freedom of movement. We're not having any of these things. So if I was a Brexiter, which, if you look at what we've written, I'm not, I wasn't, but if I was, I would be pretty happy with this, because this is really entrenching a relatively hard Brexit. But what it is doing is setting, I think, taking some of the worst excesses off and putting in place a basis of a more permanent relationship with the European Union that is frankly going to be a little bit like the relationship that Switzerland has, which is ongoing negotiations on certain areas, grown-up, sensible negotiations, not extreme rhetoric. It's not a surrender document. That's complete nonsense. But it's a sensible, modest step forward, but it's not transformative either.
Yes, the man there with the suit and the white shirt.
This is supposed to help British businesses to export their produce to Europe, but this has just given... the Europeans won't need to buy these fish because they can come and fish for themselves. They've got carte blanche for 12 years now to catch the fish for themselves, so that's damaged the export market.
And do you think the trade-off with reducing the checks on meats and poultry products, that kind of thing, going into the EU, that's just not worth it?
Where's the reciprocity for British businesses to perhaps fish in Europe, for example?
OK. Now, I can see someone who's got a green jacket with their hand up, but I can't see your face. No, further back. Further back. No, it's really hard to get you. There you are. There you are. Can you see? Yes. Oh, no, I can see. And you've got a sort of check top on. There you are.
Yeah. Objectively speaking, is it good for fishermen? No. But I think the Tory on the panel is using the fishing industry to exaggerate his point. When you look at the fishing industry, how much does it contribute to the GDP of this country? It's less than 0.5%. So stop being disingenuous, and you know it.
The woman in the red jacket, yes.
Linking very much to what the gentleman has just said, the fishing industry is contributing 0.03. I think the deal is standing. It's not a sellout. It's not an amazing deal. It's a symbolism of a first step. And pollers are saying that up to 64% of the population want a closer relationship to the EU. And I think we can move forward from that.
And even though fishing does contribute a small amount to GDP of the UK, obviously if you're in one of those ports in Grimsby, whatever it might be, this will feel like it's pulling the rug out from under your feet. Do you not have sympathy with them?
Yes, of course I do. But I think we need to look at the bigger picture, and we need a close relationship to Europe because we have war in Europe.
Inaya.
You know, as you mentioned, you know, I stood for the Brexit Party in 2019, but even someone that campaigned for Brexit, I think there is a lot of Brexit exhaustion, and we don't want to rehash many of these debates that were very divisive for the country. So I am quite sceptical of the rhetoric of surrender. I don't think that is the...
So you don't buy that, then? Because that's very much how Reform are talking and how the Conservative Party.
No, I think that most people in the country welcome a more conciliatory tone with our neighbours. But at the same time, I think it is wrong to completely exaggerate this as this particularly historic moment. It isn't. It's quite thin on the ground, and there's still a lot of elements that need to be worked out. But I do think, actually, to me, it is revealing of a wider failure of imagination. Of course, Europe are our nearest neighbours, are a big trading partner for us. But the truth is, for example, Germany entered a technical recession in 2023. There's huge economic stagnation, sluggish growth, low productivity.
I mean, not everywhere. Spain is doing extremely well.
Well, but a lot of the biggest economies are extremely struggling in Europe, and there's huge international markets in India and China, and also the US.
We've just concluded a trade with India as well.
Absolutely, and I think that there is a failure of imagination when we constantly just debate whether we should be closer or further away. We should engage with them, we should trade with them, but we absolutely should be looking at across the world and dealing with our own deep-seated structural issues in this country, which I think are actually the biggest challenges for why we have low economic growth. It's not just about the European Union.
Can I come back on
Well, can I just bring Kashi in first, because he's not had a chance to say.
I mean,
and I will come back to you.
From where I'm sitting, my simple view of this is that this deal is the first stage of the damage limitation. That's really fundamentally what this boils down to. I agree very much with what Zanny is saying here, that we've gone from a world where we had, whatever your politics, we went from a world where we had completely frictionless trade with our nearest neighbour of a market of 500 million people to where we find ourselves now. This isn't a revolutionary deal that we've got here. And what really, really frustrates me is if Kieran is going to sit here and say this isn't a good deal, tell us what you think is a good deal. We don't hear anything about actual thing of what will happen. And so that's the rhetoric that I really don't buy. So the other two things to note is the lady also pointed out over here and the chap up there about the fishing industry. We do more in the gaming industry in this country than we do with the fishing industry with respect to the people whose livelihoods depend on that. I understand that. But perhaps the most damaging thing for me is this issue around the youth mobility scheme. I am somebody who benefited from the Erasmus program. I went to live in France. I learned French. I've made lifelong friends. I got to experience a different country subsidised by the UK government and the European Union. That was critical to anybody's ability to become more socially mobile.
Can we just explain, not everyone's familiar with Erasmus. Erasmus is basically, it's a year abroad when you're a student, and it's a reciprocal arrangement.
Any university would have a reciprocal arrangement. I ended up in a beautiful place called Saint-Etienne, and it was a really transformative time of my life. Today, most children will not have that opportunity. This scheme now, Nick talking about it, they're trying to find a way of limiting it and giving people the opportunity to come here. What do the Tories and others tell us? Oh, it's free movement of students all over again. Kemi Badenoch and the Conservative Party, who got us in this mess in the first place, don't have any ideas. They're bankrupt of ideas. So, and as far as the Labour is concerned, they can't over-egg the pudding. They have to be realistic with people and say, this is only the first stage of the damage limitation, and it will probably be another decade where we probably will get to where Switzerland is now, and you'll see what that will look like, but it won't look like being in the European Union.
So Kieran, you want to come back in. What about answering Hash's question? Given that you're very clear you don't like this deal. You regard it as a surrender. What deal would you like to see?
I'll come directly onto that point about, for example, different ways and better ways that we can do things. But what I think is really important when
come on to that straight away.
When you're dealing with another country is whether you're treated with mutual respect. And when you talk about how could we do things differently, why can't we have mutual recognition of standards, which is what we had asked for? Mutual recognition, because they could accept our goods, we have continued to accept theirs. When everyone talks about their frustration with trade barriers, and I understand that frustration, what people forget is those are trade barriers that the EU is choosing deliberately to put in place to make life difficult for us because we dared to say we want to go our own way.
So usually with these trade deals, usually there's, I've never done a trade deal. But what I can see about them, there usually has to be a bit of give and take.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
and there tends to be.
So where's the give?
So it tends to be, typically in a trade deal, you have an independent body that mitigates disputes that might occur between countries. And that's what we said we should have. And the EU said no. They said that we will let our courts be the ultimate arbiter over any disputes. So whether you believed in Brexit or not, whether you think it's a good thing...
This thing about the European courts...
No, you had a lot to say. I'd like to come back on some of those...
Let Kieran speak. Let Kieran speak.
They have said that EU courts will decide. And when it comes to how we can do things, yes, they have ultimately. No, it's not. They have said there's an independent arbiter, but the ECJ will be the ultimate decision maker on whether
No, you're mistaken. I've got to correct that. I've got to correct that.
What can we do differently?
Hang on. Hang on. Oh my God, this is... Do you know what?
Hang on. Such a sense of deja vu.
So am I. Hang on a minute. Hang on. Wait, no, I have. But you've made a comment about the European Court of Justice. You say you want to correct that.
Absolutely.
Very briefly.
Kieran is mixing up the independent panel. The independent panel as exists in any trade deal exists here. And Kieran is mixing up having to refer a very specific interpretation of European law to the Court of Justice, which then refers it back to the panel, which I negotiated the deal, Kieran. It comes back to the panel. It says independent arbitration panel.
And it says
paragraph 29, read the deal.
And it says that the independent panel has to regard the ECJ's ruling as the ultimate arbiter.
It doesn't.
Point about can we do things better? For example, Hashi quite rightly raised students and the flexibility that was there for students. We came up with a better way of doing it. We said instead of just saying only students from the EU could come here, and that's the only measure of exchange, let's open it to the whole world. And we had the Turing scheme, so that the best and the brightest from all different countries outside of the EU could do exactly the same thing. What's wrong with that? Why do we only want to limit ourselves to the horizon of Europe? I want us to have students coming from all different countries who are the best and the brightest.
But therefore you don't mind about students coming from Europe?
The Turing scheme looked more widely and was quite restrictive.
What they're talking
about
is okay.
Yeah, but you can have a deal with the European Union and have another one beyond that. That's the point.
Listen, let's hear a bit from our audience, because you've got your hands up. And you're shaking your head, so I can say, well, let's see, you're shaking your head in the green... you've got a green hoodie on, I think.
Yeah. I mean, from my point of view, much as you said previously, there's no reason why you can't have students from across the world. But as you mentioned, there's no reason why you can't have a separate deal with the European Union as well as one with other countries. So, again, I'm sorry, you're being disingenuous, and this is just not right. You cannot keep quibbling about things that matter to most of the people in this country.
Well, look, let's hear. We've only had one voice from the audience so far who is agreeing with Kieran, or I don't know if you're agreeing with him wholeheartedly, but certainly with some of it.
I agree with him on some things.
That in terms of the EU reset deal, in terms of whether this is actually a good deal for Britain or not. Is there anyone else who takes a view that actually this is not really where we want to be, what we want to be doing? Yes, you've got your hand up there in the middle.
I think they're trying to move away from the issues about trade. Because this trade, why pick on fish? And yet that is not what is very important in any common household. We're affected by the price of bread, price of milk, which has got excessively high. This is what affects a normal household, not fish. So it's important that they should not really try to do a deal by the back door while the normal household are being affected daily. They cannot feed their children because they cannot afford to buy a bread of bread. It's a very serious issue.
OK. And anyone else share the view that actually this deal is not the right thing for the United Kingdom? Yes, you in the cap, you take that view, do you?
I believe that the deal was a good first step. I don't think it's a good deal. I mean, it's just for less than 4% of the GDP in terms of figures involved. So
yes,
I understand that it should have been, we should have gone a lot deeper, but I do understand the limitations and the politics behind doing that. So I'll be patient.
And there was, just behind, you had your hand up with the glasses and blue sweater, yeah.
I think we need to go further than the current deal. I think taking the issue of students, the sun set on lots of Europe when we left the European Union. And as a current student, I think this deal was an important first step in reopening that door to rejoining Erasmus, but it's definitely not the end step.
OK. All right. Well, look, I'm sure... I mean, it did feel like a real déjà vu on this panel, didn't it? But I am sure we will come back to the subject of the EU at other points in this programme. I'm going to leave it here for now. There's all sorts of other things that have come up this week. Before I do, I just want to tell you where we'll be next week, which is Cheltenham in Gloucestershire. And the week after that, we're off to Llandudno on the beautiful north coast of Wales. So if you live in or around either of those two, Llandudno or Cheltenham, and you'd like to come and be part of the audience, apply to the Question Time website and hopefully we will see you there. Right, let's take our next question, which is from Nilufar Mershed. Oh, there you are.
Do the crime, do the time. Why is the government allowing prisoners to be let out early?
So this is a story that was broken today as a result of something called the Independent Sentencing Review, which is led by former Conservative David Gauke. Plenty of recommendations, including shorter prison sentences, being let out after a third of your time for good behaviour for many prisoners, not all, but most. Fewer people going to prison for less than a year. Something that has grabbed the headlines is potentially mandatory chemical castration of sex offenders and a mass expansion of electronic tagging. Huge expansion of that. Kieran.
Well, as Fiona mentioned, I spent some time as a volunteer policeman, and actually, if I was to pick one thing that made me want to be an MP, it was my experience and views that victims for many, many years of different governments haven't been at the heart of our criminal justice system, and particularly when it comes to sentencing, that what people think is a fair sentence for the crime, I think should be not totally decided, but driven by what victims of crime think and what families think and what the public thinks. So actually, I think the review today, set aside what the government wants to do, but the review itself was deeply offensive to the victims of crime, some of whom I've had the privilege of working with, because it was described as a landmark review of sentencing policy and what determines proper punishment. And there was not one sentence in that review that talked about what the victims of serious crime and their families might consider to be punishment. And I think that is insulting to victims. People that I've worked with, for example, Katie Brett, whose sister Sasha, when she was 16, was stabbed 100 times, raped, and had her body set on fire. Those are the sorts of people I've worked with and who don't think they get justice. The killer of her sister will serve perhaps 35, 40 years, and she was clear that he should never get out of prison.
And under these reforms, he might still not.
Well, they're different. It's quite complicated, actually, because the review wasn't allowed to look at sentencing. But if I can just finish the point, not only did they not say what do victims want, the only thing they really did talk about in the review was the suggestion that victims are just confused. And if people like Katie and other victims understood the sentence they were going to get, they wouldn't be so angry. And I think that's just really, whatever is good in this review about the better ways we might deal with offenders, to me that is put to one side in the face of that sort of insulting approach to what victims think, and they should be at the centre of this stuff. The recommendations themselves, I also have problems with, because what they're actually going to say is that it's not just kind of what are typically described as low-level offenders, which is a problematic term because all crimes, I think, have victims, but some of the most serious offenders, rapists, people who kill through manslaughter, child abusers, some of the worst, who we changed it to say should spend at least 2/3 of their time in prison. The review recommended spending half the time in prison instead, and Labour have already said that they would accept that recommendation. So Labour are going to allow rapists, child abusers, people like that to get out of prison earlier, and I think that is totally wrong.
And the fact that it was a Conservative Justice Secretary who came up with some of these proposals, that doesn't influence you?
As I said, I was interested in these issues long before I was a politician of any particular party. I'm not saying that any Conservative previous administrations always got it right. But certainly the review itself was offensive, and the fact that we would consider on the back of that letting out some of the worst offenders in our society earlier, I think is completely wrong.
Well, Hashi, let's bring you in as a barrister.
Yeah, I just think that using extreme examples and the rhetoric that you're using to try and inject that kind of extreme examples into what should be a rational debate does not help anyone.
Well,
The reality is David Gauke's review is a serious review. It has some serious recommendations, and not all of them will be accepted by this government. We should never allow some of the serious offenders who are in our prisons to ever walk our streets at all. But what this is about is that we currently have 87,000 people in our prison system. We have a broken criminal justice system that doesn't work from the moment you're arrested. The police are completely and utterly swamped. The solicitors who are trying to visit you in your cell can't cope. The barristers are not getting paid enough to be there. The buildings that we call our courtrooms are falling apart. The judges don't have enough time to be hearing these cases. The prisons are full of people who are waiting for their trials to happen, who are yet to be found guilty. Then by the time they get to their hearing 2 or 3 years later, they've probably spent more time in prison than they might have got in their sentencing. And even after they've been proven guilty or they've pleaded guilty, God forbid they've pleaded guilty just to be able to actually serve time and not even have a chance, the moment they come out, the probation system is broken. So they might not even be able to come out because the probation system can't cope with it. And I wonder who we should turn to tell us about how that happened.
Hashi.
Hang on.
It's bonkers. It's absolutely bonkers.
Hashi, hang on. Hashi, on that basis, what the Justice Secretary Shabana Mahmood is coming up with today doesn't even touch the surface.
I agree with you. This is why I'm getting to the point. Last year, when they came in, they were talking about getting more people out of prison. Do you remember that? This year, it's barely even been a year. July will be a year they've been in government, and they're talking about releasing more people. So the answer to this issue, here's where I might agree with Kieran, isn't getting more people out of prison. The answer to this is fixing the criminal justice system so that we actually have a system that works, that people who should be in prison are in prison for the time they should be and are released when they're supposed to be. Resourcing the system that's been cut to the bone since the coalition government is why we've got to. So the review is welcome, but it's a plaster on a gashing wound, and we'll be here again in a year. That's the reality.
Let me hear from our audience. Yes, the man there in the middle with the check shirt.
Hi, sorry, this guy keeps saying exactly what I want to say.
I'm sorry.
No, you're spot on. There's a pattern here. It's the same with Brexit. A lot of these issues were caused under the Conservative government, and now there's a government trying to clean up the mess they made. And they're giving out about the way they're trying to clean up this mess. And like he just said, the prison system, if he's so worried, if the Conservative government is so worried about these victims, and he keeps talking about the victims, the fishermen and the people that are raped, etc., why didn't they invest in the prison system when they were in power? If they were seeing this happening down the road, rather than now coming on talking about these victims and saying poor those victims and blaming the Labour government for trying to do something under a broken system.
OK, I will come back to you, Kieran, on that. One at the very back.
We're talking about the kind of prisons being overcrowded, but actually it's kind of, I think what we need to look at is the causes of why people are committing crimes. And actually, if we don't actually deal with the cause, with the illness that there is in society, that kind of means people are potentially desperate. There obviously are people who are committing crimes that are completely unacceptable. But actually there's reasons people are committing crime, and it's through kind of issues within society that actually we're not dealing. And actually, when are we going to start looking, and I think this is open to all parties, when do we start looking at the causes for reasons and trying to solve those problems kind of at the bottom, and then you're kind of dealing with something before it gets to the point of overcrowding.
OK. Man there in the white t-shirt and the grey shirt. Yes.
We are indeed in the midst of a prison crisis. However, Lucy Connolly will spend more time in prison than some of the men convicted in the Telford grooming gang scandal. What does it say that the justice system wants to punish tweets more seriously than child sexual abuse. Maybe if we could look at that, we might be able to address the number of people...
That's a misconception of what took place. Of Lucy Connolly's case, she was somebody who was inciting racial hatred during a period... I would strongly recommend you read the judge's sentencing. The sentencing from the judge will have been following a particular set of guidelines which has a starting point, which then considers aggravating features to come out at the answer. Nobody has put that woman in prison longer because of a tweet, but because of what she did, how she did it, and when she did it. So it's really important that you educate yourself on that before you say something like that.
Let me just clarify for those who are not aware of what's happened to Lucy Connolly. So Lucy Connolly, in the aftermath of those terrible, terrible Southport attacks, she put out a tweet urging people who read it to set fire to a hotel housing asylum seekers. She did then delete it, and she was given 31 months, and she lost her appeal this week. So, look, I know you want to come in. By all means, talk about that, but let's also talk generally about why is the government planning to let criminals out early, and what has come out today of this independent sentencing review?
On the specifics of the Lucy case, I think that she said a despicable and immoral thing in a clearly divisive and extremely troubling time when riots were taking place and so on and so forth. I don't actually think that that's disputed. I think the question is whether someone should get 31 months in prison or be sentenced to 31 months as a result of that when she has a husband that has bone marrow failure, she has a young child, and she has no previous convictions in the past. So I think that there is a really important question to be asked there about why people are being sent to prison when we know that actually sex offenders and other people that commit crimes are being given suspended sentences. I think that that's the question that a lot of people are asking. It's not so much the specifics of whether what she did was right or wrong. But on the question of the broader issue that we're talking about today, the Conservatives undoubtedly left the prison system in an absolute mess, but that does not mean that what is being done is an answer to that or anywhere closer to an answer to that. When we had the last early release scheme, someone actually came out and then committed murder within days of actually being released. And the reality is, for a lot of people, it feels like the social contract is being broken, where if you commit crimes, even if it's so-called petty crimes like shoplifting, antisocial behaviour, burglary, you will essentially get a slap on the wrist. And I regularly, go to my local supermarket and the security guards are completely overwhelmed with the amount of criminal gangs that are just wreaking havoc on communities. And I think that these things lead to a huge lowering of living standards and a general sense that the quality of life in this country is declining. And I think I've read some really shocking statistics that between 2007 and 2018, 32,000 people avoided prison that had over 50 previous convictions. So I think I would argue that we need to get much tougher on criminals. We need to jail career criminals. I don't think that we should be letting people out early, because I think that actually doesn't address some of the underlying causes that we're talking about.
So it's build more prisons and loads of them, because we're due to run out of places. I think, is it by November? I mean, you probably know these figures, but carrying on at the current rate, we are going to run out of prison places. And Labour's planning to build 3 more.
12% of the prison population are foreign nationals. I think that that's even another area that we need to be looking at.
We've deported 4,000 foreign national prisoners since we came to office.
And I think that we should be going much further. But the reality is that crime is going through the roof in this country, and letting out people that are committing dangerous crimes, I don't believe is the answer.
OK. Woman here in the green dress.
I was going to say, also, surely looking at how to reduce reoffending, so some of the smaller sentences, the recommendation against having these smaller sentences, because you're basically creating a school for crime and you're increasing reoffending. If you want to reduce the amount of victims of crime, you need to reduce the amount of reoffending.
I completely agree with you, and I think that's actually one of the areas where the most focus needs to be made. I mean, just to put this into some perspective, we have, 87,000 people in the prison system. It's the highest in Western Europe, but we have the highest reoffending rate in the rich world. So whatever it is we're doing, it's not working. And a large part of that is putting in prison on short sentences people for low-level crimes. And what we're doing then is we're taking troublemakers and we're turning them into career criminals. Because you go into prison, what do you learn? You're bunched up with a large number of other criminals. You learn how to become a criminal. So I think of the many very sensible things in this review, that's where the focus needs to be. Cut those custodial sentences down and use other things, whether it's overhauling the probation system, tags, all manner of things you could do. But don't put these people into a school for where to become a criminal.
All right. I will. Hang on, because I haven't brought Nick in on this conversation yet. So, Nick, there's all sorts of recommendations in here. We've talked about, letting prisoners out early after a third of their sentence, more use of probation service, greater use of rehabilitation. One thing that's caught the headlines is Shabana Mahmood saying, the Justice Secretary, saying that she would consider mandatory chemical castration of sex offenders. Do you want to tell us a bit more about that?
Look, I think every parent's nightmare is harm coming to their child. And I think that we, as politicians, as the government, have a duty to do all we possibly can to keep the public safe and to keep our children safe. Now, it is already the case that this happens voluntarily in our prisons. And I think Shabana Mahmood is absolutely right to look at extending that and see if we can go even further to keep the public safe. But
Is that something you would support, mandatory?
I support absolutely what Shabana Mahmood is doing on that and doing all we can to keep children and the public safe. But can I just come to the core of the argument here? Because, I was a barrister before entering politics. I worked in our criminal justice system for a while and I met many, many victims of crime. The last Labour government added about 28,000 places to the prison places in our prisons. In 14 years, the last Conservative government actually added only 500. And that meant that in July last year, when the general election was called, our prison system was running at 99% capacity. And let me just explain what that would mean. If we literally had our prisons overflowing, it would mean that judges up and down the country wouldn't be able to send the most serious offenders to prison because there would be nowhere to send them. Literally, there would be no purpose to police arresting people on our streets. And it makes me angry, actually, when I think of those victims I met, that that's the situation they were left. It was frankly criminally negligent that the prisons were left in that state. And what that means is, frankly, there are no easy options. We talk about building new prisons. Absolutely. This government will embark upon the largest prison building programme since the Victorian period, with an extra 14,000 places. But that is not going to help us with the situation we find ourselves in.
And so what do you say to Hash's point, which is, this is a step in the right direction, but it's going nowhere, it's not even touching the sides of the issues.
It would be nice to build homes when they come out of prisons as well.
OK, let's get on to that in a minute. But in terms of the criminal justice system, people spending enormous amounts of time on remand, they can't get court time, the judges have got too much work, the probation service said it would be catastrophic if they are not given sufficient resources to deal with this huge expansion of work they're going to have to do.
No, and you're absolutely right to raise this general issue, and it speaks to, frankly...
But what are you going to do about it? That's the thing.
Public services being on their knees when we came into office. But let me just take specifically where we are on this, because we have to, as a matter of urgency, deal with this situation in our prisons. And what the government has said today is that those offenders who are identified as being a danger to the public going forward, they will not be released. Terrorists are not going to be released onto our streets. The case that Kieran was raising about a terrible murder by the sounds of it, murderer wouldn't be released. But what we're going to have is a system. It's based on a model that's been working in Texas. Shabana Mahmood went to Texas to see this model in action. It is about behaviour in prison. There has to be that good behaviour in prison to be released at 33%. If that behaviour is not there, then prisoners will continue to serve. But we have to take this emergency action in relation to our prisons to keep the public safe.
Kieran, I know you're itching to come back in. Do you want to answer the question from the person in the audience who just said, why didn't you just build more prison places? If you feel so strongly about having people in prison, why didn't you do it? Do you want to answer that question?
Well, I think it's important to respond to two points.
I want you to answer the question from the audience. That's the point of the programme.
Of course, I believe in ensuring we have enough prison spaces to lock people up. And
do you accept that the government the previous government built not enough of them?
If I can add, the prison that's been most recently opened by Labour, we built. We built that prison, set that process in place. It just so happened that the building finished after we had come out of government. I regret that we weren't able to build more prisons at a faster rate. But if we're saying that the early release of prisoners that the Labour have had to undertake is a demonstration of the system we left, remember, last time they were in, they let out 70,000 prisoners earlier because of their mismanagement of the prison service, and they haven't had to release anything like that number of people. So I think that gives you some perspective. But in terms of the
that's you saying you're both equally bad.
About the broader debate about what we do with prisoners, I think we absolutely have to distinguish between those people who absolutely we can do more to divert from crime, to set on a different path. And I believe passionately in that. But I'll go back to what I said. And you criticise me, Hashi, for bringing up an example of a murder as some way, an extreme case. Please tell me which rape and which child abuse and which killer of a child, perhaps because they've run them over in their car, is not an extreme case. I mean, those are the things that our criminal justice system deals with, and it's those people who want to see appropriate punishment. That is what the justice system is also there to do.
Right.
And Nick has to accept that you will be letting out people who commit earlier some of the most egregious offences like rape and child abuse, and I think that's indefensible.
You should take responsibility, Kieran.
OK. I'm going to move on to our next question because I want to fit two more in if I can. Sunil Gupta. That's you. OK, we've heard from you already. Let's hear your question.
Given this week's change on winter fuel payments, does the Prime Minister need a roadmap, considering he keeps making U-turns?
Well, so Keir Starmer, I mean, the government denied it for weeks, saying a month, winter fuel payment, the cuts to that are here to stay. And then Keir Starmer said this week, we want to ensure that more pensioners are eligible for winter fuel payments as we go forward. What he didn't say is how many more will receive it and when they will receive it. Does the Prime Minister need a roadmap, Inaya?
I think that would be quite well advised, actually. I mean, a Labour minister, Lucy Powell, she said that we would have an economic crash if they did not cut the winter fuel payments. Well, clearly, after the local election results and the fact that they have reform harking on their heels, and the fact that the winter fuel payment came up a lot in terms of what people felt was very unjustified and unfair, they're changing their tune on that. And to me, that's not just the Labour government listening. That seems to me to be desperation and running scared. And the problem, though, is that there are bigger questions, though, that I do think that we need to ask as a society when it comes to the ageing population, whether that's the social care crisis, whether that's the question of the triple lock on pensions. I mean, I'm in my 20s and I speak to other people in their 20s who don't believe that they're going to get a state pension, quite frankly, because we have an ageing population, low birth rates, and the welfare system does seem very unaffordable.
So would you like to get rid of the triple lock?
I think that we need to have a whole national conversation.
Yes. That sounds like a yes.
I think we need to have a national conversation.
But what would you like? Would you like to see it abolished?
What's the end of the conversation then?
Well, I think...
You must have a view.
I think that we need to have that discussion, definitely, because the reality is... The reality is
Sounds to me like you think you should get rid of it, but you don't want to say it right now.
I don't think that we should get rid of it right now, but I think that for future generations, I think we need to really think about the sustainability of the welfare state, and that also includes pensions. So I think the problem with the winter fuel thing is that it's just some tinkering around the edges without actually bringing up a really mature and important conversation we do need to have about the way that taxes and money is distributed fairly across the generations. I think that's a very legitimate thing to do, but this does nothing to actually address that.
OK, Zanny, given this week's change on winter fuel payments, does the Prime Minister need a roadmap, considering he keeps making U-turns? That's the question.
Well, I completely agree with Inaya. I think this was a sort of political car crash from the very beginning. It was, at its best, it raised a modest amount of money. They didn't prep it last year at all. It was a politically unbelievably tin-eared thing to do. If you're going to have sort of lose a lot of political capital, then at least do it over something that is meaningful. And I happen to agree with you about the triple lock. In fact, I'm quite a lot older than you are. I'll go further and say the triple lock should go. I think in an ageing society, we cannot continue to maintain these promises to the older generation, leaving a huge burden on younger generations. I think we need to have an honest discussion about that, and I think the triple lock should go. But I think the winter fuel debacle is, for me, problematic, not just because it's a sort of test exhibit A for the tin-eared nature of this government, with apologies, Nick. But I think it's also problematic because once you've done one U-turn, I don't know whether the driving analogy works, but you probably do more because you will.
That means you keep going round in circles, effectively.
Well, that actually is a very good analogy then, because that is what they're doing. Because there are huge economic problems in this country. This government came in with an enormous majority, the ability to pursue some really dramatic and radical change. I don't know. It's been timid. It's been non-radical. It hasn't done very much, and when it has done things, they've been politically tin-eared and they've done a U-turn. So I think this is a problem because it's symptomatic of a risk this government faces. So I don't think they should have done the winter fuel payments, but if having done it, now doing this kind of U-turn, particularly when it was the Prime Minister and not the Chancellor, she was off somewhere else, I don't know, the whole thing smacks of political desperation, as you say.
All right. Man here.
We're talking about the triple lock on pensions as being an example. Also today, the government has done another U-turn. There was only going to be 2.8% for teacher pay rises. They've been given 4% today. All of the other health services, the fire, the police have all been given quite reasonable, sensible rises. I'm a school business manager. I can't afford to pay 4%. My budget for next year went up 0.89%. And out of that, I've got to find 4% extra in salaries without the cost of everything else. If we don't start balancing our books and looking at things like the triple lock, and yes, I'm ageing as well, and I'm about to retire at the end of this school year, so it does affect me. I think we are going to create a bigger and bigger problem that future generations are quite right. They won't get a pension, but also will they get health services? Will we have to start charging for schools? Will we get to a point where we can't afford state schools?
Woman there in the glasses.
I mean, do we really live in a world where anything is guaranteed anymore? Should anyone think that they are due a winter fuel payment? I mean, it's lovely to think that we could have some more rational conversations and talk about means testing, but also what about the fact that many of these people are in homes that are much too big for them, that they can't afford to heat, quite literally, and why they're so desperate for these payments? What are we doing to actually encourage an aging population to downsize? You know, are we talking about reducing stamp duty on people who downsize their houses to create a space for people who have growing families? Like, it just seems like there's absolutely zero imagination in any of this, and it's really just boring.
Okay.
I mean, I think we have to wake up and realise that the way young people think about money and the future has radically changed. I mean, young people now can't afford to go to university. They're not going to save up for a house, have, 2 kids and a dog, diligently have a kind of job that pays a pension. It's just, not reality that young people have that same arc or curve or thought in terms of their own financial literacy. It's just not the case right now.
And so what do you make of the fact that the government has done a U-turn on winter fuel plans? Do you welcome it, or do you think actually they should have stuck with it?
I think it's minuscule when you think about the amount of people that it's going to affect. And I think, it's just it's a political play.
So, Nick, listen, we talked a lot about triple lock of pensions. I mean, for those who aren't familiar with it, it means that pensions will rise either by average earnings, by inflation, or by 2.5%, whichever is the higher. I mean, this is just a sort of sample of people talking in the audience here, but there's not a lot of happiness about either the winter fuel allowance should have come in the first place, or actually, what you've done now is just tinkering around the edges, not dealing with the real issues facing us.
Well, look, firstly, we support the triple lock on pensions. It'll be worth about £1,900 to pensioners across the course of this Parliament. But just to take the issue of means testing of winter fuel payments, we had to take a series of very difficult decisions when we came into office, of which the means testing of winter fuel payments was one. But since then, we've been able to build on that foundation. The first quarter of this year, we had the fastest growing economy in the G7. And even in the last 3 weeks, huge votes of confidence in our economy, not just the EU-UK trade deal we discussed earlier, but also we've secured an economic deal with the United States, we've secured a trade deal with India. And it's right now that as the economy is improving, we do look at increasing the number of pensioners who are entitled to winter fuel payments. And I just say this, I don't think anyone thinks it is a good use of public money to be paying the winter fuel payment to millionaires. I think it is right to means test.
Yes, but lots of people who aren't getting it are not millionaires, Nick, as you well know.
And that is exactly right. Fiona. And that is why, after the local elections, the Prime Minister said, I get it, and that is why we will be increasing the number of pensioners.
But what you've got is pensioners are now in a situation where they think, well, am I going to get my winter fuel allowance then? And when might I get it? Now, Gordon Brown, he knows a thing or two about Labour. He talks to Keir Starmer. He said, look, Keir Starmer won't be waiting till the October budget. He said, I'm sure Keir wouldn't have announced something like this if he didn't have a plan of how to achieve it. So when will people know whether or not they're going to get their winter fuel allowance or not?
Look, we've said we will announce it at a fiscal event, and we want to obviously move forward with this. But we want to do it
again, Gordon Brown said, look, I'm not saying Gordon Brown is interchangeable with Keir Starmer, but, you know, when he speaks about Labour things, it's worth listening. He said, Keir Starmer will not wait until the October budget. That would be too late. Is he right?
Well, look, in respect of this, we will obviously be responsible with the public finance.
Is he right about that? Will people know before the October budget?
We will make sure that we are identifying where the money is coming from.
Yeah, that's not what I'm asking you. Will people know before the October budget?
We've seen the effects before of trying to make spending pledges. Liz Truss did this in terms of tax cuts without saying where the money's coming from. So we won't do that. And it's right as the economy improves that we judge this. But of course we want to move as soon as possible.
So does that mean before the October budget then, doesn't it?
Sorry, it'll be announced at a fiscal event. That's what we've said today.
So June then? Next month?
No. June is not a fiscal event. We will announce it at a fiscal event, but we want to move as quickly as we can as the economy improves.
Can I just on carrying on the car analogy of U-turns and car crashes? Maybe around Downing Street, you might need to establish a low-traffic neighbourhood.
Very droll.
So that he knows he doesn't go too fast. I mean, look, I'm a big believer that the triple lock pension is completely and utterly indefensible now. It's a multi-generational betrayal of people who are young today, who are getting a raw deal of having to pay a significant amount of tuition fees. They come out of university saddled with debt. They can't get... They're still living in their parents' homes well in their 20s and 30s. They might get a good job. They might not have a decent pension, and the world is more unstable than we've ever known it. That doesn't seem like a very good social contract to be giving to most of our young people today. Now, on Labour U-turning on the winter fuel, I agree that in the end, this is a very small amount of savings that they have now paid a big political price for. And those people who voted for reform to think that they might have an idea for them, I'm sure you really didn't think they had an idea for that either, but it was a protest vote that showed, at least in part on that issue, that people were unhappy. But there is also another fundamental question that arises out of what's going on with Labour that is troubling me. So one of the things that Labour has done in my world as a planning lawyer is they've talked about building 1.5 million homes in this parliament. Whether they actually achieve that or not is a different matter. But the planning reforms that they have put forward are genuinely incredibly ambitious, and they could genuinely make a difference. What's concerning is at the first local election, they seem to be balking and turning on this particular issue. And it really, really concerns me that in 2-3 years' time, are they still going to stick with these particular reforms that will make a difference to so many people and so many people's chances to get on the property ladder? And the final thing I'll say is that lady talked about the lack of imagination. I completely agree with you. When you think about the number of people who are living 2 or 1 person in a massive house that they can't afford to heat themselves, and there is no incentive for them to downsize, there is a fundamental lack of imagination that doesn't tackle these issues in multiple places. And then you go for something like winter fuel, you come unstuck and you come running back to your low-traffic neighbourhood. And that's where we are now. So we need to do better, and I really hope Labour will hold its nerve where it matters most.
Kieran, let me just remind you of the question, Kieran. Given this week's change on winter fuel payments, does the Prime Minister need a roadmap, considering he keeps making U-turns?
Well, it's not, I wouldn't say just U-turns, breaking various pledges that they made before the election to get elected, whether it's national insurance, which they said they wouldn't put up, but they have, whether it's reducing the use of hotels to house illegal migrants, they said they'd bring down, and they haven't, it's gone up, whether it's saying that they weren't going to tax our family farmers, but they did. Again and again, you can't trust what the man says, I'm afraid, from week to week. Now, of course, I welcome the fact that they made this decision. It was more than 10 million people affected by that decision. I had about 20,000 pensioners in my constituency that were affected and who contacted me over winter and told me the stories of the difficulties that decision took. And both the winter fuel payments and the triple lock weren't done for no particular reason. They were done because we had an issue with pensioner poverty in this country. Of course, I accept there are some better off pensioners, but there are also some very poor pensioners. And pension credit was one way in which we tried to tackle that, but actually the winter fuel payment as a quick and simple way to ensure that people were able to heat their homes over winter was an effective policy that made a difference. And as you said, Fiona, now we're in the situation where they don't know, are they going to get it, aren't they going to get it? They might already be the sorts of people that try and financially plan throughout the year, and they can't really do that now. They need to very quickly tell people what that decision is going to be, who will and won't still be left out, and I think that's very important. And I know people sometimes think that, you know, this narrative that the pensioners had it easy. You know, you've got to think about why we introduced that idea of the pension going up in a regular way. It's because actually, if you're retired, if you're on a pension, when the economy changes around you, inflation, wages go up, you're not part of that. That money doesn't come to you. Your wages don't go up. You don't get a raise just because prices have gone up. So those mechanisms are there to ensure that relatively pensioners don't become poorer and poorer over time. And I'm proud that we brought that intervention in. And as I said, it made a big difference to pensioner poverty over the time that we were in government.
OK. Man there in the glass in the middle.
Personally, I'm very relaxed about the government doing U-turns, and I wish governments would U-turn more often when they realise they've got something wrong, and it shows a certain humility to put your hand up. But the bigger concern I have is about that word that's been mentioned about a roadmap, which is the more glaring issue facing this country is the total absence of a strategic vision for the country. And I think in Keir Starmer, we have someone who is an administrator. He's a placeholder for someone who's going to come in. He's cleaned up the Labour Party. He's solved some of the problems around anti-Semitism. He's doing some sensible things, but he's tinkering around the fringes. What he doesn't have is a vision of what kind of UK he wants to build for the 5-10-year horizon, what kind of values we're going to have, how we encourage and incentivise wealth creation. And when you don't have that, what you end up with is a philosophy of redistribution that simply takes a diminishing pie and then parcels it out to prisons. If prisons win, then the health service has to lose. If we fund Ukraine, then our pensioners can't heat their homes. We should be able to do all of this if we can grow the economy. And you don't grow the economy by increasing capital gains tax and taking less tax income year on year, as we have done. Capital gains is down from the high of 17 million 4 years ago to about 13.5 million. You don't increase growth by taxing non-DOMs who pay, on average, the same amount of tax as 500,000 average UK taxpayers.
Okay.
You don't increase growth by increasing employers' national insurance contributions, so it's more expensive for them to employ people.
I'm just going to interrupt you only because we've got about 30 seconds left, and you've made a lot of comments very articulately and powerfully, and I must let Nick respond, given that they're all directed towards the government. You've only got about 30 seconds.
Keir Starmer's leadership, taking us to where we're in opposition to government, has been remarkable. He has a plan for change to deliver safer streets, a better NHS, better opportunities, all driven by a plan for growth. And I have to say, if you want to see an outstanding example of his leadership, just look at what he's done in the world stage, leading in Europe. It's been remarkable.
OK. You don't look satisfied by that, but there you are. That's the answer you're going to get, I'm afraid.
Plan for growth one more time without seeing the plan for growth.
Yeah. Right. OK.
Show me the plan.
Made your point. OK, that is it for this week. Next week we're in Cheltenham. The week after that we're in Llandudno. But from Dulwich, from our panel, thank you very much. From our audience, thank you for being here. From Dulwich, bye-bye.